Okay, so yeah, I think we can get started. So, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Always a pleasure being together and learning together. Today's class, again, is Death, Love, and Life in the Thought of Franz Rosenzweig with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. I think everyone here has already been to our classes, so I think we can jump right in. I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Sure. Thank you, Evie. This is our fifth of six sessions on death, love, and life and the thought of Franz Rosenzweig. So this is our second to last session, and we are going to be tackling at least an aspect of a topic that is very, very important for Franz Rosenzweig, and that is the topic of redemption itself. The reason I say this is a very important topic for Rosenzweig is because if you're familiar with his great philosophical work, right, it is titled The Star of Redemption. And if you put something in the title of your magnum opus, right, that usually is indicative of the central importance that it plays in your thoughts, right? So for Rosenzweig, redemption is very, very important. It's the engine of all of his thought. It's the engine of existence in a certain sense. And there's many different aspects to it. We're only going to focus on one particular aspect of it today, particularly as it relates to the ideas of revelation that we have been talking about the last 2 weeks. So if you remember, the last 2 weeks we've been focusing on the concept of revelation, which is also absolutely essential for Rosenzweig. We talked about how for Rosenzweig, revelation is a miracle, right? It's not something that happens, through reason. It's not just a myth. Right, revelation is something real. It's a moment, and it's an encounter, it's an event, and when it happens, it feels like the impossible is essentially happening to you. For Rosenzweig, the primary way to understand what revelation is the experience of love, right? Experience of falling in love, the experience of encountering the other who loves you. That moment is in many ways a rupture. It fundamentally takes you out of whatever existence you had before and opens up a whole new way of being before you, primarily because the moment of revelation, it teaches you that there's another singular other in the world, right? We talked going back to the first and second session, right? All human beings are created in the image of God, which for Rosenzweig means all human beings are singular, right? Everybody is in a sense unique, but that singularity of the human being is what makes them unlike anything else in existence, right? There's just something about them that you can't quite put your finger on, that when you encounter it, it just means this person stands out apart from everything else. And in the moments of falling of love, we encounter the singularity of the other, but what it also does is that love calls to our own singularity, right? Meaning when we fall in love, experience love, we discover the ways in which we exceed ourselves, right? That we had a certain image of ourselves beforehand, and then love sort of awakens within us these dimensions of who we are that exceed the way we had thought about ourselves, previously. And for Rosenzweig, the moment of revelation, the moment of falling in love, is the moment when you hear the other calling your name. And when the other calls your name, right, you cannot help but turn to answer, from with the call. You feel compelled by it, right? To hear your name being called is in some ways, or I should say, is the way for Rosenzweig in which we experience the notion of mitzvah, right, of commandments. Because when you hear your name being called, you can't help but turn. And for Rosenzweig, the key, question of revelation is in many ways not just do we turn, but can we respond to it with the response of Hineni, right? As Abraham responded to God, or we might say Naseh Nishma, right? What the Jewish people said, how they responded to God at Har Sinai. And what those expressions essentially mean is not just like, I heard you, right? What they mean is, I am here with you. I am recognizing my relationship to you, my responsibility to you, right? The way that your call binds me to you, right? And if you're able to commit to that call of the other, right, you are committing to it in many ways in an absolute sense, what we call covenant, right? That sense of being inextricably bound to the other, that you're going to remain committed to them, loyal to them, right? You're going to show fidelity to them no matter what, because that's what love demands, right? But love always demands the sense that you're going to be there forever, right? Anything less than that is conditional, right? And there's something about that just makes love into something else, right? If my children, think that my love for them is that I will love you now, but I don't know what it's going to be like in the future, right? Like, what kind of love really is that, right? So the response to the call of love on some level is understood as being, an absolute one, right? That's what it means. Even if you can't always know into the future that you can guarantee that love, right? In that moment, at least, you are trying to make a fundamental commitment to it. That's Brit. That's the moment that Avram experiences with God. That's the moment Jewish people experience at Har Sinai, right? So the question is, if that's revelation and how revelation leads to this moment of commitment, right? What happens next? And the what happens next is really, in many ways, the most important question, right? Revelation is a moment in time, right? It divides our experience of the world into a before and after, as Rosenzweig talks about it. But the question is, what comes after, right? And for Rosenzweig, what comes after revelation is that ongoing process of redemption, both on an individual level and on a collective level. And for Rosenzweig, the shift from revelation to redemption raises one of the most, I would say, important dilemmas in religion in general, but particularly in Judaism, which is the way we often feel that there is this conflict between our relationship to God and our relationship to other people, right? And one thing that's very important for Rosenzweig is that revelation is between us and God, right? And redemption is always between us and other human beings, right? One of the things that's important to understand with Rosenzweig vis-a-vis redemption, it's not something that we necessarily are putting on to God, right? That there is a profound human dimension of redemption, but maybe not in the way we're used to necessarily thinking about it. Normally, we think about redemption being a human-driven process. We often think about it in terms of tikkun olam, right? Perfecting the world, right? We think about it in terms of like improving the world politically, ethically, morally. For Rosenzweig, redemption is not necessarily exactly those things. Redemption is how we relate to the other who is in front of us, with an eye to the other who is a little bit even farther away from us. And the challenge that Rosenzweig has to deal with is, how do we sort of balance our relationship with God vis-a-vis our relationship to human beings? How does revelation and redemption not be essentially like a conflict, right? We might say in Jewish thought, the mitzvot ben adam l'chaviro often feel like they're in conflict with the mitzvot ben adam l'makom. I just did the reverse by accident, but the vertical obligation ben adam l'makom is in conflict with ben adam l'chaviro, the horizontal obligation. Right? Probably the best example of that we know, and again, we can go back to Avram here, is that at beginning of Parshat Vayera, right? It takes place after Avram has already had the Brit Milah, the circumcision, right? Avram is an old man. He's clearly in pain, still recovering from that circumcision. And we are told that God appears to Abraham, right? God reveals God's self to Abraham. It's a moment of revelation. We don't know exactly what happens next, but the very next, at least between God and Abraham, but what happens next in the Parsha, so Abraham is sitting in front of at the entrance of the tent. It's the hot part of the day. Suddenly he sees strangers traveling in the distance. And Avram in that moment appears to say, essentially, God, I'm glad you're hanging out with me, but I'm going to go run and, make sure to welcome those guests. And Chazal famously say in Masechet Shabbat that it is greater to receive guests than it is to receive the divine presence. And what that idea, again, seems to say is that there's somehow a conflict between these obligations, and there are moments where you might have to choose. Now, for Rosenzweig, that is a false way of thinking about it, as we're going to see. What is profoundly important for him is that revelation, the love of God and our relationship with God, is the engine and what propels redemption, our relationship towards human beings, that they can't be in conflict with each other. And if we think that they are, right, there's actually something fundamentally wrong with the way that we are responding to the experience of revelation. So let me just open up for a moment the slides. So the thing that I'll say before we start looking at some of the text that's just important to keep in mind is that for Rosenzweig, what revelation does on some level is open us up to the neighbor, right? Open us up to the one who is near us so that we can love them. And the reason that's so significant for Rosenzweig, that revelation turns us towards, not necessarily even just towards God, but more importantly, towards the neighbor, is because Rosenzweig understands that in many conceptions of religion, and really for the most part, the way that we conceive of our own lives, the ability to turn towards the neighbor, the one who is other, the one who is different, the one who is not me, right, is something that is very, very, very difficult, right? It's particularly notable within Christianity, but within Judaism as well. This idea that ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, that we should love the neighbor, is in some ways meant to be a universal obligation. It should apply to everyone, right? And there's a certain absurdity to that kind of thinking, as we'll see in a moment, because that's just not the way we experience the world. We love certain people and we don't love others. And we don't tend to believe that our love should be something that expands potentially to anyone. I would say at a certain level, Rosenzweig understands that critique. One might even say he agrees with that critique. You can't love everybody all at once. But what he understands is that the alternative, that we only love ourselves, and we only love those people who are closest to us, most like us, part of us, that's not fully sufficient either. So before we look at Rosenzweig's text, I'm actually going to start with Sigmund Freud again, because Freud does a wonderful way of setting up problems. And in Civilization and Its Discontents, one of his later works, he spends actually a whole chapter basically discussing the mitzvah of Ahavta l'recha kamocha. You should love the neighbor as yourself. And Freud has a real problem with this mitzvah. And I think we have to take him very seriously in his analysis of the mitzvah, because what he's basically going to argue is that if God thinks this is something that should be incumbent upon us towards everyone, that just doesn't seem possible. And there's, like I said, good reason to think why it's not possible. So I want to look a little bit about how Freud understands the mitzvah ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, and then we'll look more at how Rosenzweig maybe seeks to offer a corrective to what Freud is describing here. So Freud says as follows: thou shalt love the neighbor as thyself. That's the mitzvah as we know it. And he says, let us adopt a naive attitude towards it, as though we are hearing it for the first time, right? Like, let's try to just understand this naively, right? Why should we do it? What good will it do us? But above all, how shall we achieve it? How can it be possible? Meaning, what does this mitzvah conceive of? Like, what consists of? What are we supposed to do? And how is it even possible? Because it sounds like it's something I have to do for everybody. And the problem with love is, Freud is going to say, and we all get this, we all believe this, is as he says as follows. Freud says, my love is something valuable to me, which I ought not to throw away without reflection. It imposes duties on me for whose fulfillment I must be ready to make sacrifices. If I love someone, he must deserve it in some way. So Freud makes 3 points here about the nature of love, and they're all significant, and they're all get at why love isn't something we just throw around to anybody. So the first point that he makes here is that love is something valuable, right? And if it's valuable, again, that means that it can't be commonplace, right? Things that we value are things that are rare, right? Things that we value are things that we prefer this and not everything else, right? So if love is valuable, it means that I don't just throw it at anybody, which means it's only safe for specific, people, times, and places, right? So this idea that it's just something I give everywhere, well, the thing which I give everywhere really isn't a value at all, right? Like if loving the neighbor is, something I can do for everybody, then maybe the ceiling of it is like, I can say hello, right? Like I can say hello to anybody, wherever I am, I can say hello. How are you? Right? Like that would be the ceiling of love if it's something I'm supposed to do for everybody. But the whole point that Freud is noting is then that means it's not very valuable, because that which you can do for anybody isn't really worth much at all. Right? What makes love is that it's something valuable. It's something precious. You can't find it everywhere. It's not something that just gets thrown around. That's point one. Point two, and this is in some ways, I think, maybe the most Jewish line of all of Freud's writings. He says, love imposes duties on me, for whose fulfillment I must be ready to make sacrifices. I love this line, right? That love imposes duty, responsibility, obligation. Those I love, I am responsible to them, for them. That they obligate me in some way, and that the way that duty and obligation manifests is that I got to be ready to make sacrifices for them, right? If your love doesn't come with duties and responsibilities, then it's not really love at all, right? Maybe it's about making yourself feel good, right? Maybe it's just about some romantic fantasy, but it's not love. Love imposes obligations always, right? Again, every spouse knows this, every parent knows this, right? Like if you love somebody, you are responsible to them, and that responsibility comes with a willingness, has to come with a willingness to sacrifice. If you're not somebody who's willing to sacrifice for others, then you can't love others, right? That's the second point. And then the third point is, if I love someone, he must deserve it in some way, right? Again, if love is something valuable, it's not something I find everywhere or just throw at anybody, right? Love has to be directed towards somebody who deserves it, right? Like there has to be something about them, some characteristic, some aspect of their personal history that they share with me that makes them deserving of it, right? Like I can't just love a total stranger, even though the Torah says love the stranger, right? Freud is kind of noting it just doesn't work that way. If I love somebody, there has to be a reason for it, right? There has to be a compelling reason that they deserve my love. And then Freud goes on to describe what are the reasons why somebody might deserve our love. He says he deserves it if he is so much like me in important ways that I can love myself in him, right? This is, again, Freud's fundamental point here. I can love other people as long as they are representative of things that matter to me. And then what I get when I love them is that I can actually, to a certain extent, love myself, right? This is the reason, I'll just point out the obvious, like why we often, our closest relationships, our closest friends are people who share our values. Because when we love them, right, in a certain sense, we're not just loving them, we love what they represent, what's important to us. And therefore, by loving them, we also love what matters to us, right? And Freud goes on here, he says, and he deserves it if he is so much more perfect than myself that I can love my ideal of my own self in him, right? Sometimes we don't just love people because they're like us, because they share the things that we're interested in. We like them because they are the ideal embodiment of the things that we care about, right? I love so-and-so because they represent the best of the things that I want in the world, right? That's the other, the other dimension here. But again, in both of these aspects, if I love somebody because they're like me, they share commonality with me, or I love somebody because they represent the best of my ideals, my hopes, right? The whole point Freud is making here is both of those are essentially narcissistic love. You love them because you can love, in a certain sense, yourself or your ideals within them. And Freud goes on to show one more example of this. He says, again, I have to love him if he is my friend's son, since the pain my friend would feel if any harm came to him would be my pain too. I should have to share it. So Freud's giving an example here of somebody you might not think you have to love, right? And this is the example of not just your friend, but your friend's son. And you might think, well, you're supposed to love your friend. You have a long relationship with them. You care about them. But, they're children. Like, not so much. Like, you don't have to, worry about that so much. But Freud is saying that we have a tendency to love not just our friends, but our friends' children. And why is it that we love our friends' children? It's not necessarily because they're amazing, because they're so much better behaved than our own children, right? We love our friends' children because we know deep down that if something happens to them, like our friend is going to be in pain, our friend is going to suffer. And that means that we're going to suffer as well. So again, Freud's point here is that our love can extend even to places we might not necessarily think it can. But again, it's still a narcissistic love. I love my friend's children because if something happens to them, it'll hurt my friend. And then if something happens to my friend, that's going to hurt me, right? That's the challenge that Freud is presenting here. To the extent that we can love others, it is primarily a narcissistic love. And it's a limited narcissistic love. It's not going to be for everybody. And Freud's point is, if the biblical commandment is, we got to love everybody. Freud just doesn't think that's either A, possible, or B, the kind of love that we might be able to offer is going to be extremely minimal. I'll just read the last line here from the last paragraph. But if I'm to love him, essentially anybody, with this universal love, love everyone you come across, merely because he too is an inhabitant of this earth, like an insect, an earthworm, or grass snake, then I fear that only a small modicum of my love will fall to his share. What is the point of a precept enunciated with so much solemnity if its fulfillment cannot be recommended as reasonable? Again, if you want me to love everybody, then they're going to just get a very small part of my love. And again, I can't really love everybody. I can love certain people, right? Because love is preferential, right? But even those people who I love, it's often because I'm able to love myself in them, right? So I actually think this is one of, Freud's most important insights. It's a fundamental psychoanalytic insight about our ego and the way that our ego relates to other things primarily in a sort of selfish sensibility. But it's important because we all know that there are moments where we try to extend our ethical concern, our love, beyond the narrow circle it usually falls. And we understand how difficult that is, right? I mean, nothing makes that clearer than a time of war, right? Because in a time of war, each side hunkers down within its own sort of group identity. And basically, it's very clear in a time of war that you're supposed to love, the people that you're with, and you're not supposed to love the other group, right? That there's war presents a clear boundary between those we're supposed to love and those we're not supposed to love, right? So it becomes very clear in a moment like our own, right, about the way in which love is often limited, maybe has to be limited. Now, Rosenzweig's point isn't going to be you should love everybody in this grand romantic sense, but he is going to push us that we have to be able to love beyond just ourselves. And that for Rosenzweig, it is revelation itself that teaches us how to love not just ourselves, to move beyond a selfish self-love, to actually be able to love the other who is different from us. So with that as background, we'll look a bit at Rosenzweig as he starts to unpack it. And what Rosenzweig offers us, which I think is interesting, is 3 religious responses to revelation, right? What happens after you've experienced revelation and how that might orient you towards others. And with these 3 responses that we're going to look at, which we'll call mysticism, the response of the zealot, and that of the sinner, right? These are all 3 are problematic ethical responses to revelation, right? Each one is a failure because in each one of these models, the mystic, the zealot, and the sinner, they can't get beyond themselves to a certain extent. They really can't get to the other. They can't get to the neighbor. Right, they're just stuck within that narcissistic circle that that Freud spoke about. But Rosenzweig here is also clearly so self-aware of. So let's start with the mystic. So it's striking because sometimes Rosenzweig himself is described as a mystic, that his sort of philosophical take on religion has elements of mysticism within it, and that is to a certain extent true. But it is also true that Rosenzweig has sort of a deep cynicism about mysticism. Because he, I think, correctly recognizes that there is often something deeply narcissistic to the sort of mystic quest, and even to the mystics that we might actually encounter in the world. So for Rosenzweig, right, the mystic is one who experiences revelation, right? They have that moment where God's presence is made real, right? Or I shouldn't even say presence, where God calls to them. And the challenge for the mystic is that once the mystic has that moment, they never want to let it go. Right. The problem with the mystic is they never want to move beyond revelation towards redemption. Right. They never want to move beyond God to turn back to the world. And that is a challenge because in a certain sense, it is much easier to stay with God than it is to turn towards the world. So I want to read a little bit from Rosenzweig how he understands that dilemma because I think he expresses it in a powerful way. He says, man defined only as an object of divine love is cut off from the whole world and closed in himself. Meaning in that moment of revelation, as I've said this before, it's just like it's you and God, right? The moment you fall in love, it's just the lover and the beloved and the whole world fades away, right? There's something very powerful at that moment in which sort of the eyes lock and, it's just you and them, just I and thou, and everything else fades away. But at the same time, there's something, problematic about that if you can't step out of that. He says here, for any normal sensibility, there isn't any mysticism, something disquieting and even objectively dangerous, right? So what's dangerous about mysticism? So Rosenzweig says, mysticism turns into the cloak that renders the mystic invisible. His soul is open to God, but because it is open only to God, it is invisible for the rest of the world and cut off from it. Right. So the problem with the mystic is, as I said, they only want to be with God. They don't want to turn back to the world. And as Rosenzweig continues, with an arrogant sense of security, the mystic turns the ring on his finger and immediately he is with his God and has nothing more to say to the world. So what's interesting is that Rosenzweig is referencing here is a metaphor that appears in Plato's Republic about a ring that when the bearer puts it on, it makes them invisible. Now, the reason this is striking is if you know anything about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, right, that's the major conceit of that book, right, which presumably is drawing from Plato, right? You have this one ring, the ring of power, that when the wearer puts it on, they turn invisible. Now, the way that Rosenzweig is using that metaphor is that the mystic, what happens for them is that once they've experienced God's love, that's all they want all the time. And for them, what they're striving for in life is to basically put that ring on that makes them invisible to the world, right? Or even just twist a little bit slightly, right? It makes the world invisible to them, right? That's what the mystic is seeking for, is essentially a ring that allows them to disappear and just be with God and make the world disappear as well. It's just them and God, and that's it, right? He says this is possible only because he wants to be absolutely nothing other than God's favorite, right? This is sort of the narcissistic dimension of it, right? In order to be so, in order that is to see nothing other than the one track running from God to him and from him to God, the mystic must deny the world. And since it will not let itself be denied, he must actually disown it, right? This is the challenge with mysticism, is that if you really want to be with God so much, right, it requires to a certain extent abandoning the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is just a fundamental distraction. Now, again, there's a certain caricature here. Much of mystical thought is trying to reconcile the problem of being a mystic in the world rather than a mystic out of the world. But I'll point out that on a basic level, right, there is a very definitive streak within mysticism of what we call asceticism, in which the mystic is trying to sort of deny the world, escape the world, right? This is a fundamental point, right? Even if we think in Jewish history, right, the great mystic in the Talmud is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who later on becomes attributed as the author of the Zohar. And if you're familiar with anything about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, right, his most famous story is where basically God declares, or indirectly God makes it happen, that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has to go into a cave for 7 years, right? That he can't be part of the world. And he and his son are there in the cave, hiding away from the rest of the world, studying, Gemara, studying Talmud all day long, right? Studying mystical secrets all day long, right? And there's something, that is true to this, that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and sort of his spiritual quest can't really be in the world. And that's why he's got to go be in the cave. And part of the whole story there is basically Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai learning how he has to actually be in the world. But the first time that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai leaves the cave, I don't know if anybody remembers what happens, but he leaves the cave, he sees a Jew, and the Jew's not acting as religious or as frum as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai wants. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai gets upset, and his mystical vision starts setting everything on fire around him, right? That Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is on such a great spiritual level that and he can't tolerate the world, and he actually kind of destroys the world, right? He has to learn ultimately how to be in the world. But the danger of mysticism is the way that it takes us out of the world, that it pushes us towards a religious sensibility that is about reinforcing a certain vision of God and our closeness with God, and everything has to sustain that. Right. I want to point out here that it's not always that the mystic hides, essentially separates from the world and is hiding in a cave. What often also happens in mysticism is that it's very important that you surround yourself with people that reflect the same exact, sort of spiritual priorities as you, right? Because part of the way that you can try to be with God is by being around other people who share that value of being with God. But once again, what it creates is a sort of narcissistic circle of care and concern, right? I'm going to be with people who really only reflect my values that will enable me to keep feeling like I'm always with God. Spiritual people always want to be with other spiritual people because it helps them feel like they can be closer to God. Now, we might think that's a positive thing, but on the other hand, again, Rosenzweig and maybe his cynicism is noting that perhaps we use that so we can be with God more, and not have to be with other people, with in the world, right? Well, in this point, I'll go back to the example I gave with Avram before. What makes Avram so fascinating is that in a lot of ways he is seen as a model of mysticism, but at the same time, if we go back to the story where God appears to Avram and Avram's in the tent recovering from his circumcision, right? Avram seems to do the opposite of what Rosenzweig is describing here, about mystics at least. Right, when Avram is in the middle of a revelatory mystical experience, what you might think is a mystical experience, instead of denying the world, what does Avram do? He actually puts himself in a position where the world can disturb or bother him. Right? If mystics typically want to hang out in a cave, where is Avram hanging out? He's not just hanging out in his tent. He's hanging out by the entrance of his tent. Right? His tent is open. Right? The Chazal say open in 4 directions. Right, so Avram experiences revelation, but Avram continues to put himself in a position in which he is part of the world, and the world can impact him, and he can respond to the world. right? Most mystics don't want to live in a tent that's open in four directions, because that would seemingly be antithetical to what mysticism is all about. And again, you don't have to be a mystic. These tendencies exist within all of us as a response to, being in a relationship with, with God. That's the first position, first problematic position, the position of the mystic. The second position, which is one that we're also deeply familiar with in a lot of ways, is the position of the zealot, right? And the problem with the zealot is sort of the reverse of the mystic in a certain sense. The zealot is so obsessed about where he thinks or she thinks creation is supposed to go, where God's plan is supposed to go, where the end goal of everything is supposed to be, that the zealot is obsessed with trying to make it happen. Right? The zealot has a picture in their mind of what redemption is supposed to look like, and it's their job to make it happen, right? They know exactly what it's supposed to be. It's their job to, take the necessary steps to make sure that it comes to fruition. Now, the problem with the zealot is that it's a bit of like narcissism of a different kind. If the mystic, right, only really wants to be with God, and I would argue only really wants to look in the mirror to a certain extent, right? The zealot has a certain sort of an idol of what it wants, like the world to be, like a fixed image. That's what an idol is. It take something and says this fixed form, right? And basically the zealot is willing to do anything to make that idol come into fruition. And the danger with the zealot, the fundamental danger of the zealot is that the zealot, if the mystic sort of turns away from the world, the zealot's in the world, right? Because the zealot is trying to bring about a certain image of the world. What the zealot does, though, is basically runs right over the neighbor. It runs right over the other. It's kind of like the neighbor or the other isn't even there for the zealot. And if the neighbor or the other has to be sacrificed to bring out the vision of redemption, then the zealot is completely okay with that. That's what makes the zealot a zealot, that they're willing to sacrifice people to bring about this redemptive vision. It's the very definition of a zealot, or Rosenzweig also calls them a tyrant of the kingdom of heaven, right? They're willing to sacrifice others to bring about this vision of redemption. And in doing so, it's as if others don't really exist for them at all. They just have this ideal that they're drawn to and attached to. And what Rosenzweig argues about the zealot is they might even argue that they're doing it for love, right? Many zealots have said that they're killing, they're killing, they feel bad about it, but it's all about bringing about this revolutionary radical change in which the world will be perfected, right? Well, there'll be love in the world. Right, there are many people who have killed for religious reasons, for the sake of bringing about a world in which there'll be love. And again, the problem with that for the zealots is that the people that they're actually sacrificing in the here and now, who they should love or be responsible to in some way, is, as I said, is as if the zealot doesn't even see them. They're not even human beings for the zealot. And the point that Rosenzweig makes is that the great problem of the zealot, if the zealot wants nothing more than to bring redemption into the here and now, what the zealot actually does is delay redemption. What the zealot actually achieves is pushing redemption away. Because if redemption is about loving the other, loving the neighbor, the zealot can't really do that, because the zealot's so fixated on the end goal, it can't actually see the other, the neighbor that is right in front of them. And Rosenzweig has this, great line here. I'll read this. It's in the middle of the paragraph. He says that he calls it that redemption becomes this arable land. I mean, this land that could produce produce, prematurely plowed by the zealot. It bears no fruit. Only when its time has come, and it comes for it too, only then does it bear fruit. But then the whole work of cultivating has to be done again afresh. The first sowing has rotted. And it certainly requires the obstinate foolishness of scholars to claim, in the view of rotten remains, that this is actually already the same that is later ripened into fruit. What he's noting here is that what all the zealot can produce is not this fantasy they have of like bounty and plenty and love and wholeness, but something actually rotten, because it's trying to achieve it when it's not the right time. And what often happens with zealots is they finally bring about their utopia, and they claim it's the most wonderful, beautiful thing in the world, where anybody else can look at it and say, this is rotten to the core. Right? And that's the danger. The zealot will look at what they've created. Instead of seeing it as rotten, they'll say, this is the end goal, this is redemption. Right? But that is ultimately always a fundamental deception. And it stems from this, absolute certainty about that vision, that end goal of what's trying to be brought about. And the whole point is that redemption cannot be sort of predetermined. Because redemption is about loving the other. There's something fundamentally, I would say, contingent about that. right? Like I can love you. You got to love somebody else. They got to love somebody else. Like you can't force that. You can't control that, right? It's something that has to be able to sort of happen on its own and at the right time. And the greatest challenge for the zealot is they're so desperate to bring about the end that they don't realize that you can't jump ahead. Like this only can be done one step at a time. Right? So that's the position of the zealot as a response to revelation, in which they try to bring about redemption, but in doing so, just annihilate the other because they're so fixated on where they want to go. The third position we'll look at is the position of the sinner, right? Most of us are not mystics. Most of us are not zealots, though we do have these inclinations at times. And even before maybe I get to the sinner, I'll just make one note here, again, using Avraham as our example, right? Avraham does have this capacity for zealotry, right? We know with the story of the Akedah, God tells Avraham to sacrifice his son, and Avraham is seemingly willing to do that, right? He's seemingly willing to basically slaughter his son, his only son, the son that he loves, the son that was promised to him, knowing he's probably not going to have any more because God said so. Now, you could read the story of the Akedah as a, again, a validation, a valorization of zealotry. But again, if you look at the story until the end, it's a little hard to read it that way, right? Because as we know, God doesn't actually want Avram to sacrifice his son. And Avram has to confront that fact that he was willing to do it, but the God doesn't necessarily want it. And Rosenzweig himself argues, or sort of implies, that the true moment of revelation there is not at the beginning of the story when God calls his name once and says Avram, and Avram says Hineni, but at the end of the story when the angel calls Avraham's name twice, Avraham, Avraham, and Avram says Hineni. That the real moment of revelation there, you could argue, is the end, right? That God doesn't want Avram to sacrifice his son. And in a certain sense, that may be a lesson that Avram has to learn, right? That being in a relationship with God, experiencing revelation, that the response to that cannot be one of zealotry. Even if we think it's right, even if we think that's what God wants, right? Even Avram has to learn God doesn't actually want that. The revelatory moment is realizing that's not what God wants, right? That's the position of the zealot. As I was saying before, most of us are not necessarily mystics or zealots, right? We have tendencies in either direction, but that's not the way we would define ourselves. But this takes us to the third position, the sinner. And I would say most of us are sinners. That's just what it means to be human. But Rosenzweig here has a particular conception of what it means to be a sinner in response to revelation. And that is as follows. For Rosenzweig, the sinner is the one who experiences God's revelation, knows they're in a relationship with God, but is still in a certain sense unwilling to see the neighbor, the other, as deserving of their love. They're unwilling or unable to see the neighbor or the other as being singular, right? Like, and created in the image of God. And the way that Rosenzweig gets at that is what he describes here as a problematic form of prayer, right? We're praying because we've experienced revelation. We know God, we want to be in relationship with God, we want to ask things from God, right? What is the prayer of the sinner? The sinner prays for the death of the other, right? The sinner prays for the death of the other. Now, that might sound a little harsh, right? We don't typically think of ourselves as praying for the death of people, but in truth, we pray for the death of people all the time. We pray for the death of our enemies, right? That's a pretty common theme in prayer. And certainly, again, in times like our current moment, times of war, everybody's praying for the death of the other, right? That's kind of pretty commonplace right now, unfortunately, right? So praying for death of the other is not something that's totally foreign to us. But there's something very problematic about that prayer. Not exactly for the reasons you might think. We might think it's a problem to pray for the death of the other because that's like just inherently unethical, right? How dare you ask God to kill somebody, right? Like that's just wrong. You should never want that. But Rosenzweig takes a different angle here. He notes that this in some ways is like a vain prayer to pray for the death of the other, because in truth, we're all condemned to death, right? This is Rosenzweig's point. Like at a certain level, praying for the death of somebody is sort of a meaningless, vain prayer because they're going to die. They're going to die eventually because everybody dies eventually. Which means if you're praying for the death of the other, you're looking at them only as like a thing, a created thing, right? We talked about this before, going back a few sessions, right? We seeing the other only as personality, right? All those attributes and characteristics that define them in this world in a very concrete sense. We cannot see them as a self. We cannot see them as the image of God, the way they exceed all those characteristics. And the challenge that prayer is supposed to open us up to is being able to see the other as not just a created thing in this world that's going to die like everything else, but recognizing that in a sense the other exceeds everything, right? The other is eternal in the same way that we are eternal, the same way that we as any human being can sort of exceed whatever constraint or boundary or structure or box that we are placed into, that human beings always can say, no, not enough, too much, I'm not doing this, right? And we even can say that to death to a certain extent, right? That's what makes human beings so powerful, is that we can say no to death. We may not win, but there's a moment where we can say no, not today, right? And that is what makes human beings stand apart from the rest of creation. And the problem is that we pray for the death of the other. We're not looking at human beings that way. We're looking at them as things that we want to die, and don't even realize they're already condemned to death, when in truth, human beings also stand beyond all of that. And the challenge of prayer is ultimately to be able to get us to realize that human beings are created in the image of God, right? That in some ways is the fundamental notion of prayer. Why do I say that's the fundamental notion of prayer? Where does it say in the tefillah that we're supposed to love other people and see them as the image of God? Well, Rosenzweig would say, once you're praying for redemption, if you see that as the major thrust of prayer, and it is to a large extent, right? Before we recite the Shemona Esrei, we say, Gal Yisrael, blessed are you, God, redeem the Jewish people. In the midst of Shemona Esrei, we say, Goel Yisrael, that God redeems the Jewish people. And we end Shemona Esrei with the blessing that God will grant peace to the world. And we end the tefillah with Aleinu, right? And the whole thrust of Aleinu is we look forward to the day when God will redeem the world. And if prayer is ultimately about anything, it is about praying for redemption. It is about praying for the rectification and transformation of the world. And that means, for Rosenzweig, being able to love others, right? There's no other way to redeem the world. There's no way to imagine a redeemed world that doesn't involve one in which you are able to love the other. So prayer has to, on some level, orient us towards that. And when we pray for the death of the other, again, we don't realize that they are an other deserving of our love. We see them as just, kind of like a rock or a tree or a flag or whatever, right? And we're not able to see how they exceed all of creation as human beings do. And so here's how Rosenzweig describes the sinner. And again, I say this is most of us because most of us sort of just see people as a means to an end. We see them as an it and not as a thou, as an I, like us, right? We think we're an I, we think we're special, we think we stand out, but we don't see anybody else that way. And that is the danger. He says, prayer for the death of the other thus demands that the other remain in eternity what he already is from the beginning of the world, a created thing. However, one would himself like to be self, awaken to his own life, and thus one who simply outlives all that is eternally other. And that's a little confusing. Rosenzweig says, we want to think that we're going to live forever when we don't want to see that as being true for other people. When in truth, Rosenzweig is actually noting that to be human is in some way, we're all eternal in a sense, in the way that we all are singular and stand out, right? That's what makes us, that's what gives us human beings the sense of their eternality. But if we can't see them that way, then we're just, again, treating them like things and treating ourselves like we are transcendent. He says an eternal wall of separation must stay standing between I and all others. That's the problem for the sinner, right? There's I stand apart, but everybody else is a thing, a means to an end. The bridge that leads from the I to the he, from revelation to creation, and above which it is written, love your other, for he is not an other, not a he, but an I like you. He is like you. The I that prays for the death of the other refuses to walk on this bridge. Instead of seeing people as I's, as fundamentally unique, singular beings, just like us, free, transcendent in a sense, we can't see them that way. And because we can't see them that way, we refuse to walk that bridge where it says that you should love the other like yourself, to recognize they're an I like you, right? There's something singular about them, just as you're singular. He wants the sinner, just like the mystic, whose secret sin is the honest sinner, the criminal, openly expresses to stay thoroughly in revelation and leave creation to the others. Meaning there's an element of the sinner where they just kind of want to be with God. They just kind of want to have it all to themselves, even if they're in the world. And that kind of makes them like the mystic. And they want to, again, let everybody else just be a means to an end. My enemies should die. Like, this is about me. Like, that's the, where we're moving forward. And the challenge with that approach, again, is that the sinner is not willing to open up to the possibility that other human beings are I's, that other human beings are, divine in a sense, We don't see them that way. We don't see most people that way most of the time. As I've said, to be able to see people this way is a profound accomplishment. It's actually a revelatory moment, but prayer is supposed to open us up to that possibility, right? That if we're praying for redemption, we're praying for a world in which everybody is seen as an I, and and we experience other people, maybe not everybody all the time, but at least the one in person in front of us, that we can experience as them as if they are created in the image of God. Right? For you is the famous line here, for what else is redemption, but that the I learns to say you to the he. But I no longer see you as an it, as a he, as a she, as a person who lives in this time and place, who does this job, who has this much money in their bank account. I finally can see you as a you, which means I can see you as an I, which means I can see you as something that is, fundamentally singular and stands apart. Not an easy thing. And most of us don't even use prayer to open us to that opportunity. Right. And I'll just note here again, to use our example of Abraham once more, when it comes to the sinner, there is a moment in Abraham's life where it would make sense for him to be a sinner like this, to pray for the deaths of others. We don't always think of it this way, but later on, or right there in Parshat Vayera, right after the moment where God appears to him and the travelers come, the strangers come, and he welcomes them, God finally starts talking to Abraham, and God says to Abraham, I'm thinking about destroying Sodom, because there's a lot of wicked people there. Now, we all know what happens next. Avram starts arguing with God. And we're very proud of that. Avram, says, Hashafet kol haaretz lo yashem mishpat, right? Avram stands up for justice. But what we don't realize there is that there's actually a much more obvious response for Avram to make when God tells him he's going to destroy Sodom. Remember, Avram knows Sodom. He knows it's a wicked place. His nephew is there. He's met the king of Sodom, right? At the same time, what he also knows is that God has promised to Abraham that his descendants will inherit the land of Israel, that they're the ones who are going to possess it, not the Sodomites, right? So when God tells Abraham he's going to destroy Sodom, what Abraham should feel is joy, jubilation, excitement, because what God is telling Abraham, these people that are in your land, that are wicked, that are taking up real estate, I'm going to get rid of them. Right? Avram should be like, oh, this is great. God's taking care of business. And now my grandkids are here. Won't have to deal with these wicked people. They'll be able to possess the land themselves. That is the response we should expect from him. That's actually a legitimate response, we might argue. If God tells you he's going to destroy wicked people, right? Especially the wicked people that were going to prevent you from being able to do the things that God wanted for you, right? You think this is a great moment. It's a joyful moment. You could say Avram's there to pray that God should destroy them. But in that moment, God does the opposite of the sinner who prays for the death of others, even those that are completely other and evil and wicked, right? Avram argues with God. He prays to God that God should save them if there's enough righteous people there, save the wicked. And that is the opposite of the sinner's prayer, right? That we realize that Avram is able to do that because on some level, he knows the people in Sodom are not just things. They're not just he, she, it's, right? They're I's, they're you's, they're singular, they're created in the image of God. And Avram's prayer in that moment is about opening up to that very possibility, which is not an easy thing, to say the least, but it is something that is redemptive. I want to transition to a little bit more about Rosenzweig and what does it mean to love the other. For Rosenzweig, again, loving the other, loving the neighbor, which is a redemptive moment, is about moving beyond ourselves, right? Moving beyond our selfish concerns, moving beyond our narcissism, recognizing there's a singular other, and that is so hard to do. Because in general, as I said, we love others because they are like us. We love others because we see ourselves in them. We love others because they represent our ideals, right? Like the challenge is, what does it mean to love somebody who isn't any of those things? And in truth, I mean, this is the hard truth. Nobody is entirely those things, right? Even our spouses, our kids, right? As much as we want to be able to see them as an extension of ourselves, and we have good reason to see them as an extension of ourselves, what every parent, what every spouse ultimately learns, often harshly, are those moments when they realize their wife, their husband is not them. When they realize that their kids may have come from them, but they are not them, right? And that, in those moments, whether love can hold, that is the fundamental true test of it. And Rosenzweig is trying to remind us again and again, that's what love really is. It's not just the things we like about a person. It's not just the way they're like us. It's the way they exceed all of that. And when people exceed all of that, it's actually the parts of them that are not so easy, right? That actually can make us uncomfortable, that can make us scared, anxious, frustrated, that those dimensions, the too muchness of the other, the way the other is contradictory. They don't seem to follow the pattern that I think I want or should, right? That makes sense to me, right? That's the moment in which the other reveals themselves in their singularity, in their full I, right? That people are people. You can never contain them fully. So here's what Rosenzweig says here. He says the neighbor is therefore, and his first point, I'll just summarize real quick, is that the neighbor is onto a certain level. True love is always somewhat contingent, right? I can come up with reasons why I love with somebody, but those reasons are always after the fact. How do I know that the whatever reasons I give for why I love somebody always come after the fact? Because I had children. And when my children come into the world, before I can really know them at all, before they have any attributes or any reasons to love them, right? I love them. And it's only later as they grow up, I immediately start saying, well, I love my child because of this, and I love them because of that. Right? One of the funniest things, I don't mean to be overly cynical here, is like the moment a parent has a child and it's a baby and it's a tiny little baby, like every parent thinks, what about their baby, right? Right there in the hospital. They think it's the most beautiful baby ever, right? Like, because once you're in love, like you find reasons to love. And Rosenzweig's point is that love is always contingent. It's always something random about it in the sense that we love even when there aren't reasons, right? Like it just is. Like, and if I have to come up with reasons, then again, it's about me, right? Love is the moment when the reason that when we love the other exceeds whatever reasons we could come up for it. That no matter how many explanations I give why I love my wife, like it will never be enough to explain my love for her, right? Because if it was enough, then I could give you those reasons and maybe you would love her too, right? But the very fact that the reasons why I love my wife, or never can convince you to necessarily love my wife, it tells you there's something about love that exceeds reasons. He says here, the neighbor is therefore only a representative. He is not love for himself. He is not love for his beautiful eyes, but only because he is just there, because he is just my neighbor, right? That's what love, meaning to open yourself up to the other. It means, again, not because I see myself in them, not because they represent my values, but simply because they're there, right? And that is something that love enables, and it is truly powerful because it means that love can essentially bridge everything, right? Even if I don't know anything about them, like my love can just be fixed, grab hold of them and say, love them. That's point one. The second point, he says here, it is not said to him by God, do unto his neighbor what he would like have done to himself. God doesn't say, do for your neighbor the things that you like, right? This practical, God says the opposite. Basically, we learn later the opposite in the Gemara, right? That which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. But the Torah never says, do to others what you like, right? This practical form of the commandment of love the neighbor served as a rule of conduct. Serving as a rule of conduct really only designates the lower negative limit, right? What Hillel taught the convert when he said, teach me the Torah on 1 foot, that which is hateful to you, do not do to the neighbor. That is the lowest level of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. But again, what the mitzvah doesn't tell us is what the upper limit is. It doesn't prescribe specific ways that love has to manifest itself. Just because the whole point here is that love is ultimately free and open and radical, right? It manifests itself however it manifests itself. It manifests itself however whatever the other wants of me, right? The other can ask me anything, and if I love them, I'll do it, right? There's no way to describe and say this is what love is, and only ad kan, only until here. Right? Love is always radical because of its open-endedness. He says here, it serves as a lower limit. The commandment forbids crossing over this limit in action, and already for this reason alone, it'll be better to express it even outwardly. For a man must love his neighbor as himself, like himself. Your neighbor is like you, hence not you. Right? This is, again, the challenge of love, is you have to recognize they're a you, they're an I, they're singular, but in doing so, you have to recognize they're also not like you. They are not you. That's, like, again, supremely difficult because, again, we love people because they're like us. And the whole point is that what the Torah is trying to teach us, Rosenzweig is saying, is we should love the neighbor because they are like you, sounds like you like them, because, again, it's selfish. They're like you should like them, right? But in truth, it's they are like you, but they're not you, right? Kamocha is not, love them because you love yourself. It's, you have to remember that they are not you. They're like you, but not you. And that is supremely difficult. As I said, parent, a spouse, it's the moment you realize they're not you that is the hardest moment to keep loving them. Again, Rosenzweig says here, the bridge that leads from the I to the he, from revelation to creation. Again, we read this before. For what else is redemption, but that the I learns to say you to the he, which may be, in my opinion, the most beautiful line in the whole Star of Redemption, because it sort of encapsulates everything. That redemption is when the I stops looking at others as its and is able to say you to them. And that moment you realize the you is an other, right? You're never fully going to grasp who they are. or they're going to exceed you, because that's again what it means to be human. And there's a beautiful letter that Rosenzweig writes at one point that gets at this, where he notes that when we encounter somebody, we get to know them. We have a certain image of them because they're our friend, and through our experiences with them, we develop a certain sense of who they are. But if you know somebody long enough, you eventually start hearing what other people think about that person. And it can sometimes be very disconcerting when other people tell you their experiences of that person who you know and love, and it's not like yours. And you have to start asking yourself, well, wait a second, this is the person I love. It's not like that. Do I take this in, this other perspective, and listen to it, or I just dismiss it, right? You can almost say here what Rosenzweig is saying is like, what do you do with the problem of Lashon Hara? What do you do when you hear things about people that you love that's not so good? Right? Our initial response is to dismiss it and say, you know what? Like, I don't want to believe that. I know that person, that other guy doesn't. I'm going to hold on to my vision of them. But that's not what Rosenzweig says here. He says, that's why I don't erase what I know about someone from others. When I hear things about from people I love from others, I don't just like discount it out of hand. All images of a person that circulate around the world belong to him. And if I want him completely, then I include all these images, including the caricatures, pamphlets, even the hate songs in my image of him. Meaning the way that others look at the people that I love, it matters in a sense, because they are reflections of the person I love. Maybe they're distorted reflections. They're different than the way I see them. They're discomforting. They're upsetting, but they are part of who the person is that I love. And instead of dismissing all of those dimensions that make us uncomfortable, we actually want to incorporate them into the picture of that person. He says, why shouldn't there be laughter, pity, even horror in love? And I hate to say it, right? There's always laughter, pity, and horror in love, right? If we try to excise the laughter, the pity, and the horror, right, we're actually not, again, we're not loving in its fullness, in its totality, right? Love means being open to the dimensions of the other person that, again, make us laugh, make us feel pity for them, or horrify us. The love and demands that we incorporate those elements of the other into it. He says, I want to love people completely just as they are. I don't love angels. I love people who are like me, who have everything that is dark in their soul, also has what I have in mind. Right? And again, he's playing again on the drush that they're like me. In this case, what he means is, just like Rosenzweig knows about himself, that he has dark dimensions, like as a human being, right? Dark sides, things that are uncomfortable, uneasy, difficult, right? He knows that the other has them as well, even the one that he loves, and they have to be part of his picture of them, right? That loving the other means being open to that dimension, of them. Now, we only have a minute or two left, so I'll just try to bring it to a close. The kind of love that Rosenzweig is talking about here can be thought of and often can be used to express a sort of morality, right? That ethics is the demand to, go beyond the self to the other. And that is a very important dimension, I would say, of morality or ethics that often gets ignored. Because most morality and ethics is based on empathy, right? I have to understand the other, completely know them. And essentially empathy says they're just like me. That's why I can have empathy for them, because their experiences are totally knowable to me. Rosenzweig is arguing for an ethics that's not based on empathy. I never fully know the other. I never fully understand the other. But when they call my name, I respond with, hineni, and I'm there for them, right? That's not an ethics of empathy. But what Rosenzweig is getting at here in his very I would say deep way of describing what it means to love the other, to turn towards the other, to turn towards the other who's just there without all the reasons that we might attribute for why we should love them, and for recognizing that love has no upper limit to it, right? Oftentimes ethics and morality is about defining this is what the right thing to do is in this context. Love never tells you what the right thing to do is, right? It just tells you where you're supposed to be, right? With the one that you love. Right, that's the challenge and the opportunity of love, is that radical openness and possibility. The other can demand anything of me, and if I love them, I'll be able to do it. I'll be able to do the impossible. I maybe feel called to do the impossible. It doesn't, but I don't know ahead of time what that means. Right, you can't go into a marriage and lay out all the ethical responsibilities ahead of time. Right, like love means just being there and waiting for that moment when your name is called, and hoping you have the strength and the courage to answer hineni. The point for Rosenzweig is this kind of love is a redemptive love. It's a transformational love. It totally changes what it means to be in a relationship with the other, because again, that other is now in the image of God, and I can see that in them. I can see them as a you, as a thou, as an I, that I'll never fully know, but still feel called and compelled by. and know that my love for them can infuse my relationship with them anywhere and always. And it can happen with anybody. Right? For Rosenzweig, the neighbor is always just the person who's there, right? The next person, right? That's the way he understands it based on the German, right? Like my neighbor, like literally my neighbor, right? They're like me usually, but they're also not me. And I don't usually love my neighbor, right? But the kind of redemptive love that Rosenzweig is talking about is when I suddenly open the door one day and look at my neighbor and feel like they're calling my name and that I want to be there for them. And because that's what love requires of us. So I'll end there, and I'll just note that we will pick up next week with our last session as we turn back to life again, turn back to the world.
In 2 weeks.
Oh, 2 weeks. Sorry, not Thanksgiving. 2 weeks. And we will try to understand a little bit about Rosenzweig's battle with his illness and why, again, the experience at Revelation, the turn towards the world, the turn towards redemption is what pushes us to be in life. Even when life gets hard, even when life gets impossibly hard, that we still feel compelled to be here now, because this is the only world you can love people in. And we always want to be open to every possibility that we get one more day so that we can love people in this world. That's what we're fighting for. And that's what we'll look at in 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff. Does anyone have any questions before I close today's session? No? Okay, thank you so much. And thank you also to everyone who's part of our learning community. Just a couple announcements. We have 2 new classes that will begin after Thanksgiving. One of them is Hanukkah, holiday of homebodies, on Tuesday, November 28th at 8 p.m. And it's with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. Also, Technologies of Transmission on Wednesday, November 29th at 8 p.m. with Rabbanit Sarah Walkenfeld. And just another reminder that this class will not meet next Thursday, but we'll have the final class on November 30th. If you're generally joining Rabbi Helfgott's class, Between Heaven and Earth, just note that the class is not meeting this Monday, November 20th, so it will continue the following week. And just if you want to see written information of all of this, it is on our website, 5784.risha.org/fall. Thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving to those who celebrate, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Lehitraot.
Have a good Shabbos.
You too.